All right, chapter 12. Up to this point, you think Parfit has been defending a theory of personal identity. And he kind of has. Remember, chapter 10, he's defending a Lockean psychological criterion theory of personal identity. And then we have this chapter, why our identity is not what matters. So this is the weird thing that you have to keep in mind. He defends a theory of personal identity that's psychological, and then he turns around and says, but personal identity is not what matters. Huh? Well, then what was the point of all that answering the criticisms of Lockean theory? I mean, it's like, why did you defend it if you're going to turn around and say it's not what matters? Well, the reason he says it's not what matters is because of the non-branching part. And remember, the non-branching part we had to introduce to deal with the branch line case. The branch line case is where you teleport, but there's two of you. And if that happens, then they can't both be you. So, so that's a way of dealing with it. Yeah, briefly, let's go back to the case where there's two of you, one on Mars and one on the Earth. If you're interested in the notion of personal identity, then the question is, what happened to you? Where are you? You can either say the one on Mars is you, but that seems wrong. Or you can say you can't say they're both you, because there is something about personal identity. Personal identity is a one-to-one relation. Either there's one person that is you, or there's no people that are you. I mean, I hope in my near future there's one person who is me. Eventually there's going to be no people that are me because I'm going to die. But what can't happen is there can't be two of you. And that's one of the problems that appears to happen with the psychological criterion, because if all that you need for a person in the future to be you is that they remember you, well, it seems like memories can be copied. Certainly nowadays we could imagine such a thing happening, people scanning us and implanting our memories into somebody else. There's all kinds of movies that play with this idea. Blade Runner, for example, although that's not the primary sort of conceit of Blade Runner, it does play with this idea of memories and identity. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen Blade Runner, there's a character in the movie who's the secretary of the maker of these there's artificial humans that are like very hard to detect. So you have to use the Voigt-Kampff test to tell if somebody's a replicant, as they're called, rather than a human being. So it's not like, you scratch them and there's like circuit boards underneath. They've got flesh and everything, but they're artificial. And Harrison Ford's character goes to visit the head of the company that makes these artificial humans. And he meets this guy's very attractive secretary and kind of falls for her. But what he works out fairly quickly is that she's a replicant, but she doesn't know it. And the reason why she doesn't know it is because she has memories of her childhood, which of course replicants don't have. They're made fully formed as adults. And he reveals to her that she is a replicant by telling her about a memory that only she would know if it was real. It's a memory, well, a couple of memories. One is, playing doctors and nurses with a neighbor kid, and the other one is a memory about spiders being born that she thinks that just she saw as a little kid when she was off on her own. So the idea there is that the memories she has were actually the memories of the head of the company's niece. And I don't know if she died or not, but he has her memories. He's scanned her brain, and he implanted them in his replicant secretary. So in theory, if you could scan them, you could implant them in hundreds of these replicants, or you could implant them in real brains or something like that. And then, so you have relation R is not necessarily a one-to-one thing. It could be one-to-many. And what happens if the niece still exists? She's still alive. If the niece dies, you might say, well, maybe in some sense the replicant secretary is the niece because she remembers her. But if the niece is still alive, you don't want to say that. And yet relation R still holds. So in order for it to be personal identity, it has to be non-branching. There can't be more than one person that you're in relation R with, that past you is in relation R with. But what Parfit is going to say is that's why personal identity is not what matters, because relation R alone is what matters. And it's okay if relation R holds is one-to-many instead of one-to-one. That's actually a good thing. That's not a bad thing. Whereas if personal identity is true, then it's bad if it's more than one, as we'll see when we get to my division. Now, one of the things we're going to talk about in this chapter is what Parfit said reading about these cases got him into philosophy in the first place. And these are famous cases, perhaps you know about them. You know what epilepsy is. So epilepsy is when you have electrical activity in your brain that gets out of control. And they discovered that what an epileptic seizure, particularly a grand mal, really serious epileptic seizure is when electrical activity sort of builds in one hemisphere of your brain. Your upper brain has two hemispheres that are joined together by a thick bundle of nerves called the corpus callosum. And signals pass between the hemispheres of the brain along this bundle of nerves, this corpus callosum. And in an epileptic seizure, what's happening is electrical activity builds in one hemisphere and then sort of bounces back and forth across the corpus callosum, getting worse and worse. And this can cause terrible seizures. And if you have really severe epilepsy, you can have almost permanent seizures, and you basically can't function, because you probably know what an epileptic severe seizure looks like. You just flop on the floor and you're foaming at the mouth and you can't remember anything afterwards. So people with severe epilepsy are basically, their life is not worth living. What they discovered, I think, in the 60s was you could stop these severe epileptic seizures if you severed the corpus callosum. So this prevented the sort of back and forth reverberation of the electrical activity. So it cured this severe form of epilepsy. They don't do it anymore, though, because it also does some very strange things. And what they discovered is that it appears to lead to a divided mind. Now, it's not as simple as all this, but the simplified version says the right hemisphere is connected to your left eye, and the right eye is connected to the left hemisphere. So one eye sends signals to one hemisphere and the other eye sends signals to the other. So if you wear special glasses, you can make each eye see different things. And the example Parfit gives is you put up something so that it has two colors, it's red and blue, but maybe one eye has got a filter on it so it can only see the red, and the other eye has a filter on it so it can only see the blue. But there's both red and blue there. And you ask the person, how many colors do you see? And it also works with hands. Like one hemisphere gets input from one eye and controls one hand. The other hemisphere gets input from the other eye and controls the other hand. So you put a pen in both hands and you say, write down. The reason why you don't just ask them is because I think it's the left hemisphere controls speech. So the right hemisphere can't talk. But it can control a hand. So you ask them to write down how many colors they see. And even though there's two colors, red and blue, they both write one. And then you say, what color do you see? And one hand writes red and the other hand writes blue. So clearly, one hemisphere thinks there's only one color there and it's red, and the other hemisphere thinks there's only one color there and it's blue. And they're not communicating because the corpus callosum is severed. What does that mean? Does that mean that inside this one person there are two minds, or are there two people in here? Well, the other weird thing is that otherwise these people function fairly normally. You know, it's not as if their hands are working differently and they can't walk or anything. No, they function pretty normally otherwise. It's just when you do these special tests, you can find out that there's what looks like two different seats of consciousness. Now, Parfit imagines, hey, this could be pretty cool. Maybe I could get a device that severs the corpus callosum and then reconnects it under my control, and the switch is my eyebrow. So normally the corpus callosum is working, but if I want to work in parallel, as when, you know, I've got a physics question, I've got a limited amount of time, and I know there's two possibilities, but if I pursue one, it won't give me time for the other, and if it's the wrong one, I'll be screwed. So what I need is to be able to pursue both of them at once. So what I'll do is I'll raise my eyebrow, and this hemisphere will work on one, and this hemisphere will work on the other. In some people, the hemispheres are very symmetrical. You know, there's that saying about right brain versus left brain. It is true that typically the left brain controls speech, and the right brain is kind of better at pattern recognition and has kind of primitive speech and so on. But some people have pretty symmetrical brains. So he says, imagine I'm one of those people where it's the tasks and abilities are evenly distributed. Okay, so I raise my eyebrow, one hand starts working on one puzzle, the other starts working on another, and suddenly I can only see through one eye. So, you know, I see myself working on this, and it's as if a neighbor is working on another problem, and I can peek over and look at what they're doing, but I'm not doing it, at least from the point of view of whichever one is me. And then at the end, when they're both finished, I lower my eyebrow, and now I remember being both. I remember doing both things. That's my physics exam. He says, we would have thought this was impossible, except that it actually happened. That's one of the things. You know, people sort of rule out as being impossible things that turn out to actually happen. And this actually happened. Obviously not the physics exam, but this divided consciousness. So he says this is going to work against the non-reductionists, because the non-reductionists say one of the things they're insistent on is this. There is this one me that exists throughout my entire life, and it's the thing that has the experiences. According to the non-reductionist, what explains this question, what explains the unity of consciousness? What ties all of my memories into a bundle? What makes them all mine? The non-reductionist says, I have the answer, and the answer is, they're all my memories because they're owned by me, who is distinct from the memories. There's a thing, the Cartesian ego, the mind, that has the memories. That's me, and what unites all of those memories as mine is the me has these memories. Whereas the non-reductionist has to say the memories exist, but there's nothing distinct from them. The nearest thing is my brain, but my brain is also made up of my memories, because what memories are brain traces. So the non-reductionist says, aha, I can explain what ties all the memories together. You can't. And what this wants to show is, well, wait a minute. You say what explains the unity of consciousness is they're all had by me. Well, what explains the unity of consciousness in these two different streams? Because when I raise my eyebrow and divide, there is a unity of consciousness for each hemisphere, but not between the two hemispheres. So, you know, I can perceive a bunch of perceptions with my left hemisphere, and I can perceive a bunch of perceptions with my right hemisphere, but they're not shared. So there is a unity of consciousness in both streams. Are you saying, you non-reductionist, this is Parfit saying, are you saying that what happens here is suddenly I have two souls or two minds, and then what happens to those two when I lower my eyebrow and I remember both sides? Are you saying two people pop into existence and then they vanish? Where did they go? He says what explains the unity of consciousness is in fact co-consciousness or states of awareness. He says on page 250, what unites my experiences in my right-handed stream is there is at any time a single state of awareness of these various experiences. There is no distinct Cartesian ego that has the experiences sort of share a property of being co-conscious. At the same time, there is another state of awareness of the various experiences in my left-handed stream. My mind is divided, so it's not that there's two minds, there's a divided mind. My mind is divided because there is no single state of awareness of both. What's a state of awareness then? It is a combination of co-conscious experiences. And he says, here's an analogy, the specious present. The specious present is actually, because if you think about time, like my former colleague Nathan Oaklander does all the time, and I can't handle it. Time is one of those things that just is too knotty a problem for me. But if you think about time for any length of time, you'll think, well, the present doesn't really exist because the present is of zero length of time. Because if you say the present is a second long, well, no, it isn't, because the beginning of the second is earlier than the end of the second. So there's time between them, and one of them is the past and one of them is the present. So the actual present is of zero length of time. Yet we seem to have an experience of the present as sort of having a length of time, like of being 3 seconds long or something like that. That's the specious present. It's not the real present. It's how the present appears to us. And you can say you are familiar with the idea of ideas or impressions being co-conscious, because in the specious present, you can suppose you're sitting by your window writing. You have experience of the visual image of the paper. You have this, and you can hear kind of a lawnmower coming in through the window. But so you're having an impression of the lawnmower, an auditory one, a visual impression of this, and they're all sort of combined. They're co-conscious. You're aware of them all at once. Now, what the non-reductionists say is you are something distinct from these memories that is having these experiences, that is having these experiences. They're distinct. They don't share anything in common, but what makes them all yours is that you are distinct from them. He says you can't believe that anymore because otherwise you'd have to say two different Cartesian egos appear when my corpus callosum is severed and then disappear. It's just you tie yourself in knots that way. So we have to find another way to explain the specious present, and it's just they have this property of being co-conscious, of being together. Now, I'm not sure how far you could develop this idea, but that's his suggestion. Oh, and he gives a good analogy. He says the non-reductionist is like Newton. Newton believed in absolute space and time. He believed there were objects, but he also believed there was something called space and time that existed before the objects. And this is kind of like the idea of there's empty nothingness existing, and then God creates the universe in it. But Einstein came along and says, no, that space and time are part of the universe. There is no time without stuff. When the universe comes into existence, time begins. There's no time before the universe. Time is a feature of the universe. And he says, the reductionist is like Einstein. They're saying that there is nothing outside of the experiences. Me is a feature of the experiences. Without the experiences, I don't exist. There's nothing over and above the experiences. So I exist, but I am composed of the experiences rather than something distinct from them that has the experiences. That's reductionism. And he says you are forced to that view because of things like the possibility of the corpus callosum severing. All right. Remember Bernard Williams, Parfit's frenemy? They got on well enough. Parfit thanks Bernard Williams for comments on reasons and persons in the introduction, but they obviously disagreed. And Bernard Williams was a non-reductionist who didn't believe in Cartesian egos. And Parfit says, well, that's just an untenable view. The non-reductionist where you believe in Cartesian egos, he says that makes sense. It could even be true, but if it was true, there'd be evidence for it, and there just isn't evidence for it, and there's evidence against it. I mean, the idea that I am a soul distinct from my body, and my soul is what has memories. Well, then what's Alzheimer's? What's happening in Alzheimer's? Why is it that when somebody damages my brain, my mind is damaged? Answer, because there is no thing separate from my mind, it's just my brain. So he thinks that at least makes sense, but it is not true. Whereas non-reductionism of Williams's kind, which says, no, there's nothing over and above my memories and my body, but nonetheless, what I am is not reducible to my memories and my body. Parfit says that just doesn't make sense. All right, but remember, Williams is opposed to the psychological theory of, in other words, what makes me me is psychological features, like being able to remember. This is the Lockean position. Williams is actually more in sympathy with what Locke's human idea, man. Locke says we are both person and human, and the human, what makes me the same human is having the same body. And what Williams is saying is, well, what I am most basically is not the person, it's the human. So I can get complete amnesia and still continue to exist because it's the body that matters. And Williams can say, the problem with the psychological criterion is you can duplicate, like in the branch line case. You can have relation R is not a one-to-one relationship, whereas my body can't divide. Ah, says Parfit, yes it can. And this is my division. So my division is a case of physical division just as much as psychological. Because he points out two things. He says, look, it's not actually my entire body that matters. It's my brain. Because even Williams, or these other people who agree with Williams, would say, if my body is crushed and all that's left is my brain, like in Futurama, where they have people's heads floating in jars in the future. They had the Beastie Boys, for example. If just my head survives, then I survive, because that's what's important. And Williams would say, all right, yeah, sure, if you could lose your body, and if your brain still worked, it would still be you. So Parfit said, well, imagine you could, in the future, me and my twin are in an accident, my body is crushed, his head is crushed, so his brain is destroyed, he's dead. I'm still alive, but I won't live long with this crushed body, so they transplant my brain into his body. So it looks like him, but it's actually me, right? And Williams would say, yeah, all right, yeah, you survive and it's you, even though it looks like him. But that's because you are your brain, and your brain survived. And Parfit says, okay, that's possible in theory. We haven't got the technology, but in theory it's possible. Okay, here's another thing that actually happens. People get strokes that destroy one hemisphere of their brain. So one hemisphere completely stops working, but the other hemisphere is unaffected. Do they survive? Now, if that hemisphere is the one that controls speech, you're familiar with cases of strokes where people have to relearn how to talk. Well, they do, because that's the amazing plasticity of the human brain. It can start rewiring. Originally, if your right side is all that remains, your right side couldn't handle speech beyond a very rudimentary level, but it can start rewiring itself, and it can acquire new abilities. So people have a stroke, they become paralyzed, they forget how to speak, but then they can learn again because the brain starts feverishly rewiring to do what it didn't have to do before. So you could survive in the case of where your body is crushed, but your brain is transplanted into your twin's body. That's possible. You survive. You survive if one hemisphere of your brain goes. Okay, let's combine the two. So your body and one hemisphere is destroyed, and the surviving hemisphere is transplanted into your twin's. I'm covering up this, but I'm covering it up on my side, so it doesn't work. But so ignore this and imagine this is what happens. If this is what happens, something bad happens to your body and one hemisphere is transplanted into it, then this is you, and you survive. And Bernard Williams would have to say, yes, that's true. And then Parfit says, but what happens if both hemispheres survive and you're actually triplets instead of twins? Both of your fellow triplets, their brains get destroyed, your body gets destroyed. So one hemisphere is transplanted into one healthy body, the other hemisphere is transplanted into the other healthy body. Now, if just one of them happens, if either one of them happens, you survive. But if both of them happens, because the definition of personal identity requires non-branching, then it looks like you don't survive. By the definition of personal identity cannot allow branching. So because there's two survivors, neither one of them can be you, because they can't both be you, because personal identity doesn't allow two people in the future to be you, because then you can get into a fight with yourself. That's just not allowed. That's ruled out by the logic of personal identity. One cannot equal two. Remember, identity is the equal sign. One equals one. It can't equal two. So they can't both be you. And if you pick either of them, it's completely arbitrary because the other one has exactly the same claim to being you. Remember, this is a case where the hemispheres are symmetrical. So if we picked just one of them, that would be unfair to the other one. So the only option that, if we're following the logic of personal identity, is to say that neither of them are you. And this is branching in the physical case. So the physical criterion doesn't have an advantage over the psychological criterion of being automatically non-branching. So branching is a problem, whatever your criterion. And what Parfit says is what this shows is that personal identity is not what matters. Because he says, if it was what matters, then a case like this, where two survive, would be the same as death. Because after all, neither one of them is me. So when division happens, there is no person anymore who is me. That's just the same as if I died. And he says, but that's stupid. How, if single success counts as survival, why does double success count as death? Double success should be better than single success. It shouldn't be worse than single success. And he has this he says personal identity equals relation R, remember relation R is the psychological criterion, plus unbranching. That's what makes personal identity. And he says what this shows is that the important part of the equation is R. Unbranching doesn't add anything. Unbranching is a red herring. You only need unbranching because of the logic of personal identity, because personal identity says you can only have one. We're obsessed with this question, is that me or is it not me? And remember, let's think again of the spectrum case, where in the middle cases, we're obsessed with the question, is that me? Have I survived? And Parfit says, reductionism says, it's an empty question. And he says the only reason you're obsessed about it is because you think either your survival is like either 100% or 0. And he says, no. Relation R can admit of degrees, and it can split. And that's okay. So your survival is actually by degrees. Personal identity says either that's me in the future or it isn't me. Either that baby is me or it isn't me. It's 100% or nothing. And Parfit wants to say, no. Relation R can admit of degrees, and that's okay. So survival is of degrees. And in fact, I don't remember most of what happened to me 20 years ago. So actually, me 20 years ago has already only survived to a less than 100% degree. That's just what happens. And maybe me alive today actually has more in common with somebody alive today who has all of my interests than me 20 years ago. Now, you can probably guess where this is leading. Remember, in the early parts of Reasons and Persons, he's talking about the self-interest theory and why it's not it's not rational to care about yourself. And this whole big metaphysical discussion of what you are supports this claim that you shouldn't be self-interested, because what the self is isn't what you think it is. The self-interest theory, remember, is time neutral, and it says your interests when at the end of your life should be equally important throughout your entire life as they are at your beginning. But that's only if what you are is 100% the same throughout your entire life. What he's trying to show is that that's not the case. That, around, sort of near to you temporally is much closer to you than further away. And that gets discussed more in coming chapters. There's another good analogy here he gives of the French Socialist Party. This is on page 260. In 1881, the French Socialist Party split. What happened? Did the French Socialist Party cease to exist, or did it continue to exist as one or other of the two new parties? According to personal identity, you would probably have to say it ceased to exist. But he says, even if we have no answer to the question, we could know just what happened. In other words, what's important is describing the relationships between the two groups. Just as in what's important in my division is describing that this remembers this and this remembers this. And that's all that's important. Is this person me or this person me? He says, forget that. That's an obsession with personal identity, this weird one-to-one relation. That is not what matters. What matters is the part of personal identity that we've argued with matters, which is relation R. So relation R is what matters. That's what I should care about. I should care about some future person being in relation R to me. I shouldn't care if there's more than one of them. So there's a good discussion of Bernard Williams's criteria for personal identity. So Bernard Williams thinks that personal identity is what matters, as do most people except Parfit. And he says we have two requirements for a theory of personal identity. First one, whether a future person will be me must depend only on the intrinsic features of that person. And that's why the branch line case is a real criticism of the psychological theory, according to Williams. So Williams says the psychological criterion, the Lockean theory, is wrong. And the reason is because the only way you can deal with possibilities of more than one of you existing because of teleporters. Suppose, the teleporter takes your blueprint and then starts printing out millions of copies of you. Now, you wouldn't know, but suddenly, according to the adapted personal identity theory, suddenly you would cease to be you, because suddenly there would be branching, because now there's several of you, so none of them can be you anymore. So you're going about your business unaware that because there's copies of you now, you're not even the same person, because you're just one of the copies now, because there is branching. And if there's branching, then nobody is the original person. So branching can happen completely in another part of the universe without you knowing it, and it will stop you being you, because suddenly there's two of you in the universe, and if there's two of you in the universe, neither of them can be you. So you can stop being you, according to this theory, without anything happening internally to you. It's happening somewhere else in the universe. And that violates the first requirement. The first requirement says whether a future person will be me must depend only on the features of the relation between us, not on these other people. So that's why he says this theory, the psychological criterion, is wrong, because it means that whether or not I'm me partly depends on features that are nothing to do with the features of the individual. Second requirement of Williams is, since personal identity has great significance, whether identity holds cannot depend on a trivial fact. And Parfit says, sure, I'll agree with both of those. But in fact, what that shows, what you don't realize, Williams, is you thought that these two requirements only worked against the psychological criterion, and you thought your physical criterion version survived. But the my division case shows that your theory as well doesn't meet these two requirements. And what I say is, yes, I agree those are two requirements on a theory of personal identity. And what that shows is there is no theory of personal identity that will meet those two requirements, so we should give up on the theory of personal identity. What will meet these two requirements is just relation R, because it meets requirement 1, whether a future person will be me depends only on the intrinsic features. Whether or not I should care about this person depends only on whether or not relation R holds between them, whether or not they have my memories. That's an intrinsic feature of them. It has nothing to do with other people existing. So yeah, that holds. And since personal identity has great significance, whether identity holds cannot depend on a trivial fact. Well, the trivial fact is a difference of one atom or something like that. I agree that that's not what matters. If there's only two atoms different, that doesn't affect what matters, whether or not I should care about them. So Parfit concludes, Parfit's position is reductionism. That is, all there is about what I should care about is atoms and memories and so on. Those are the things I should care about. I shouldn't pretend there's this extra fact like the existence of a soul or something like that. That's not what I should care about. And I shouldn't obsess about whether or not somebody in the future is me. That is obsessing with the self, which is irrational in the same way that theory S, the self-interest theory, is irrational. I shouldn't get so hung up on the self. I should say I should care about someone in the future because they have my memories, because they're carrying out my intentions. Remember, it's a two-way street. Memories is backwards facing, intentions is forwards facing. That's what I should care about. I shouldn't care about whether or not they're me. Now, he does give a kind of humorous discussion on page 265 about why division is not as bad as death. Some people, he says, it could be worse than survival, and for some people it could be better than survival. In one sense in which it's worse than survival is, he says, it would be unpleasantly uncanny to have a duplicate. I think it would be worse than that, and I wrote a little story called You and Yours, which you can read. But another thing that I think does a really good job of showing how bad it could be to have duplicates is a novel called Dark Matter, that's going to be a movie soon, by this guy called Blake Crouch. And in this novel, there's like thousands of you, and they basically all try to kill each other because they're competing for the same love and for the same life. They think only one of them can have that life. So they will kill the others to get possession of what they think is theirs. So I think it's a lot worse than Parfit suggests. But he does say it's better because basically I get twice the life. That is, instead of just one person carrying on my intentions and carrying on my memories, you get two of them, or one individual. Let's avoid the word person. So if something happens to this one, and this one survives, a little bit of me continues. So it's better. Finally, he says, it would be weird if I was the only one to come up with this theory of reductionism, and everybody else in the history of ideas was non-reduction. He says, fortunately, that's not true. Buddha has exactly the same idea. And in Appendix J of Reasons and Persons, he gives a whole series of quotes of Buddha that basically say, rid yourself of the idea of the self. There's just what you're made of. There's just the parts. There's no whole beyond the parts that you should get obsessed with. And Buddhists, of course, are famously, say, stop being so selfish, stop focusing on the self, focus on the universe in general. And he said, essentially, with my weird academic philosophy, I have reached a Buddhist position. And he says, I find that very comforting that I'm not the only one that this idea has occurred to. And I think I'll tie it up there.